On the edge of the known world, families carved their lives from wilderness. There were no safety nets, no hospitals, no neighbors within reach only. The merciless reality of nature. Starvation, disease, bitter cold, and crushing loneliness stalked every settler's cabin. Children grew up never knowing if tomorrow would bring harvest or hunger. Mothers buried infants in frozen soil. Fathers gambled survival on the swing of an axe. This is the untold story of the silent war that shaped generations. How ordinary families waged daily battles against starvation, disease, and isolation on the frontier, and how some lived while many did not. The story of frontier survival begins long before the first log cabins were raised or wagon ruts scarred the soil. It begins in crowded villages, debt-ridden towns, and cities straining under the weight of poverty, inequality, and political unrest. For thousands of families, the promise of a frontier fertile land waiting to be claimed was both salvation and gamble. The edge of the wilderness offered hope, but also demanded a price few fully understood by the early 17th century. European societies were marked by sharp divisions. In England, land was increasingly concentrated in the hands of wealthy landlords. The process of enclosure privatizing what had once been common land drove peasants from fields they had farmed for generations. Agricultural workers, stripped of livelihoods, crowded into cities where opportunities were scarce and hunger was common. Poverty was not the only burden. Religious dissenters, whether Puritans in England, Huguenots in France, or Anabaptists in Central Europe, faced persecution for their beliefs. The frontier became more than land. It was a chance to live free from kings and bishops, overseers and landlords. The Americas represented the most dramatic of these frontiers. Colonies in Virginia and New England became destinations for those seeking escape. But long before the push west across the Appalachian Mountains, settlers arriving on Atlantic shores faced a wilderness they barely comprehended. Jamestown, established in 1607, promised fertile soil and wealth from trade. What colonists encountered instead was swampy terrain, brackish water, disease, and the thin line of survival. Within a year, most of the original settlers were dead. The starving time of 1609 to 1610 saw colonists reduced to eating shoe leather and, according to multiple accounts, resorting to cannibalism. The dream of new beginnings clashed violently with the reality of unyielding land. In New England, Puritan families left England not only for land but for the freedom to build communities shaped by their own faith. When the Mayflower landed at Plymouth in 1620, its passengers carried ideals of religious purity and self-rule. Yet half of them died within the first winter. Frozen ground, unfamiliar crops, and inadequate shelter turned their covenant with God into a test of endurance. Survival came not from the dream of a new Jerusalem alone, but through aid from Wampanoag, people who taught them to plant corn, use fish as fertilizer, and adapt to the cycles of a harsh northern climate. As the colonies stabilized and populations grew, the frontier pushed westward. Families left coastal towns for the valleys of Pennsylvania, the forests of Kentucky, and the plains beyond the Appalachian barrier. The motivations remained familiar: land hunger, poverty, and freedom. In Europe, inheritance laws often meant only eldest sons could claim estates. Younger sons, and those with no land at all sought fortunes abroad. In America, land became the currency of independence, a tangible escape from cycles of labor and servitude. But the promise of abundance was deceptive. Clearing wilderness was labor beyond imagining. Dense forests stretched for miles, and every acre demanded back-breaking work. Families felled trees with axes, burned stumps, and carved fields from soil filled with roots and rocks. It could take years before a homestead produced enough food to sustain itself. Until then, settlers lived in fragile cabins, often with dirt floors and roofs that leaked in the rain. Hunger was constant, and a single failed harvest could mean catastrophe for immigrant families. The wilderness also meant leaving behind every trace of familiarity. European villages provided networks of support neighbors, churches, markets, kinship ties. On the frontier, isolation was the norm. Cabins might stand miles apart, separated by forests where wolves howled and travel was perilous. Letters to relatives overseas described the loneliness as much as the hardship. In 1630, one Puritan colonist wrote, "We are in a wilderness. We have no friends to help us, no inns to entertain or refresh our weather-beaten bodies, number houses to repair unto." The emotional stakes of leaving civilization behind were as great as the physical. Trials. Religious freedom, too, proved double. For those who crossed the ocean, liberty often meant imposing their own rigid systems. Puritans who fled persecution in England built communities with strict codes of belief. Dissenters among them, Baptists, Quakers, or even more radical Puritans faced fines, imprisonment, or exile. On the frontier, the ideal of freedom was always balanced against the need for conformity and survival. A family alone, cut off from its neighbors, was unlikely to endure. As expansion moved deeper into the continent during the 18th century, the promise of land continued to draw families outward. Pennsylvania became a haven for German immigrants, the Pennsylvania Dutch, who sought farmland and religious toleration. Scots-Irish settlers poured into the backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas, moving into rugged valleys and ridges. Each wave carried its own traditions, but all shared the same challenges: how to feed, shelter, and protect a family on the edges of empire. Disease remained one of the deadliest adversaries. Malaria thrived in swampy lowlands. Smallpox swept through settlements, sometimes carried by the very ships that had brought new families across the ocean. With no trained doctors in isolated areas, families relied on folk remedies, herbs, poultices, bleeding, and prayer. Mortality rates were staggering. In some frontier communities, it was common for parents to bury half their children before adulthood. Letters and church records speak of loss with painful regularity. And yet, for all the danger, the frontier held irresistible pull. Land represented not only survival but dignity. In Europe, peasants often remained tenants for life, tied to landlords. In America, even the humblest family could claim acres of their own. That vision, however incomplete, sustained many through hunger and hardship. "I like it very well here," one German settler wrote to relatives in 1749, "though we must work hard. But what we work for is our own." The first families on the edge of the wilderness lived in constant tension between promise and peril. They dreamed of fertile fields, but faced barren winters. They sought freedom, but often encountered new forms of constraint. They left behind crowded streets and familiar faces, only to find themselves in vast silence, broken by the cry of animals or the crack of trees in the wind. The frontier was not empty. It was full of challenges, dangers, and peoples whose lives had already been rooted there for generations. The decision to step into that wilderness was never simple. It was driven by poverty, land hunger, religious ideals, and the dream of better futures for children yet unborn. But it was also a gamble that costs many their lives. For those who survived, the frontier reshaped not only their existence, but the very identity of the societies they built. They became symbols of endurance, their struggles remembered as the foundation of entire nations. This was the beginning of the silent war with nature. It was fought not with armies, but with axes and plows, against hunger and disease, in solitude and in silence. And for the first frontier families, it was a war whose outcome was never assured. For the families who ventured into the frontier, the very first seasons often proved decisive. Those who imagined fertile fields and endless opportunity quickly discovered that nature was not a passive landscape waiting to be claimed. It was an adversary unpredictable, merciless, and indifferent to human survival. The first blow was always the hardest, and for many, it came within days or weeks of arrival, when settlers reached the edges of new territories. They often arrived at the worst possible moment, too late in the season to plant crops, too early to harvest, and entirely unprepared for the climate. For those who landed in Virginia in the early 1600s, the swampy lowlands produced diseases rather than abundance. The waters of the James River were brackish, filled with salt during dry spells, and brimming with mosquitoes that carried malaria. Newly arrived colonists, weakened from months at sea, had little resistance. Fevers, dysentery, and infections spread almost immediately. By the end of Jamestown's first summer in 1607, nearly half the settlers were dead. For Puritans in New England, the enemy was not malaria, but winter. When the Mayflower landed at Plymouth in December 1620, the timing could not have been worse. The ground was frozen solid, food stores from the voyage were nearly exhausted, and exposure to the bitter Atlantic cold claimed lives rapidly. By the end of their first winter, only 52 of the original 102 passengers remained alive. Graves were dug in the frozen earth at night, their locations disguised to prevent native observers from recognizing the settlement's weakness. The dream of religious freedom had collided with the lethal reality of New England's climate in later centuries. As waves of settlers crossed the Appalachian Mountains and pushed into the Ohio Valley and beyond, the pattern repeated. Families often arrived in late autumn after weeks of travel through mountains and forests. Cabins were hastily constructed with unsealed logs, leaving gaps that wind and snow poured through. Many lacked sufficient food stores, relying instead on hunting that proved unreliable during the first critical months. Wolves prowled near settlements, livestock perished, and families found themselves trapped in makeshift shelters as winter storms buried their hopes of survival. Hunger was the most immediate hardship. Without established fields or barns, families relied on whatever supplies they had carried. Flour, salted meat, dried beans, and cornmeal provided sustenance for a time, but these stocks dwindled quickly. Diaries from frontier families, record meals reduced to broth, made from animal bones, or bread stretched thin with ground acorns or bark. The hungry months, as they came to be called, stretched from late winter into early spring, when food stores ran out and new harvests had not yet grown. Nature's first blow was not only physical but psychological. Settlers wrote of despair when confronted with endless forests, unbroken plains, and the silence of isolation. The sheer scale of wilderness was overwhelming. One immigrant in Pennsylvania described the land as a dark, endless wood without paths or people, where one feels swallowed by trees, the absence of familiar landmarks, markets, or even neighbors, magnified the sense of vulnerability. For families accustomed to village life, the loneliness could feel as crushing as hunger. Disease compounded every difficulty. On the frontier, the simplest injuries infected, cut from chopping wood, a burn from cooking over an open hearth, a broken bone from clearing land could spiral into deadly conditions. Without doctors nearby, families resorted to herbal remedies, poultices, and bloodletting. Sometimes these worked. Often they did not. Smallpox carried along trade routes, ravaged settlements. In 1633, an outbreak in New England killed entire families and spread rapidly through native communities with even greater devastation. Colonists who survived such waves were marked by scars for life, reminders of nature's invisible blows. Storms struck with equal ferocity. In the open plains, tornadoes destroyed cabins in minutes. On the East Coast, hurricanes toppled ships and erased harvests. In northern settlements, sudden blizzards trapped families indoors for weeks, leaving them to ration dwindling supplies. Accounts from New France describe settlers tying ropes from cabin doors to barns so they could find their way through snowstorms without becoming lost and freezing to death only yards from shelter. Fire was another constant threat. Cabins built of dry timber and thatch caught quickly, and once flames spread, families often had no means to extinguish them. A single spark could reduce a year's labor to ashes, forcing survivors into the open wilderness with no shelter at all. Some families rebuilt, others abandoned their attempts and returned eastward, their dreams shattered by one catastrophic night. Despite these blows, resilience defined those who remained. Survivors learned to adapt. In Virginia, colonists dug deeper wells and drained swamps to reduce disease. In New England, they built sturdier homes with insulation against the cold and planted corn with techniques borrowed from indigenous peoples. Across the frontier, families quickly recognized that survival required humility before the land, not dominance over it. The first blow had taught them that nature could not be bent easily to their will. The human cost, however, remained immense. Records from early New England towns reveal mortality rates that dwarfed those of European villages. In some frontier settlements, 1/3 of new arrivals died within their first year. Cemeteries filled with the graves of children and young mothers testify to the price of establishing footholds. In the Ohio Valley, 18th century pioneers wrote of burying loved ones in unmarked forest graves, fearful that hostile raids or animals might desecrate them. Every family that endured carried scars, physical, emotional, or both. The harsh, welcome-shaped frontier culture in lasting ways. It instilled caution, practicality, and community reliance. Families realized that survival often depended on neighbors, even if those neighbors lived miles away. Barn raisings, harvest shares, and communal defenses emerged not from generosity alone, but from necessity. The blows of nature were too great for one family to withstand alone. Still, the frontier retained its pull. Letters sent back to Europe or Eastern towns often balanced grim warnings with encouragement. One German settler in Pennsylvania admitted in 1725 that our first year was bitter with hunger and toil, but followed with, "Now we reap the fruits of our labor, and every field gives enough for our children." For every story of abandonment, there was one of perseverance. The dream endured, even after nature's first blows left families staggering. The opening years of settlement across the American wilderness were defined by these encounters. Hunger, disease, storms, fire, and despair tested the will of every family who dared to stake a claim. Many did not survive. Those who did were hardened, their identities reshaped by the realization that survival meant endless struggle. The frontier did not welcome newcomers. It resisted them, forcing each to decide whether the promise of land and freedom was worth the pain of endurance. This silent war with nature began not with battles against animals or storms, but with the humbling of human ambition. The wilderness did not yield easily, and for the first families, the welcome they received was as harsh as the land itself. Food was the frontier's most constant uncertainty. For families carving their lives from untamed land, every meal was a calculation, every season a wager, and every harvest the difference between survival and death. The line between abundance and famine was so thin that even a single bad winter, one failed crop, or a broken supply chain could tip entire communities into desperation. The fragile promise of land, promise of fertile soil, was one of the greatest lures drawing families into the wilderness. Broadsheets and colonial advertisements painted the Americas as vast, overflowing gardens waiting to be cultivated. Recruiters spoke of endless fields, rich rivers, and abundant game. For many immigrants, this vision stood in sharp contrast to the overcrowded villages and exhausted farmlands of Europe. Land meant food, independence, and dignity. But reality quickly undercut those dreams. Fertile soil often came wrapped in layers of forest that took years to clear. Stumps had to be uprooted, stones removed, and fields burned before seeds could be planted. Even then, the first harvests were meager. Families depended heavily on hunting, foraging, and whatever crops they could coax from the ground, without reliable surplus. The margin for survival was perilously thin. The hungry months, the period between the exhaustion of winter stores and the arrival of the new harvest, became known as the hungry months in New England. This often stretched from March through June. By late winter, salted meat, dried beans, and grain barrels were depleted. Families rationed what remained, stretching meals with broth or bread made from ground acorns and bark. Accounts from Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay revealed the extremity of these struggles. Governor William Bradford recorded that at times colonists had to live upon clams and mussels and ground nuts and acorns, and these got with much difficulty in a barren wilderness for weeks. Meals consisted of little more than shellfish or whatever could be dug from frozen ground in Virginia. Colonists faced the same precarious cycles. During Jamestown's infamous starving time of 1609 to 1610, food shortages reached catastrophic levels. Besieged by Powhatan warriors and cut off from trade, settlers consumed horses, dogs, and rats. Archaeological evidence confirms accounts of cannibalism, with at least one body showing signs of butchery for survival. Though extreme, this episode symbolized the fragility of food security on the frontier. Hunting and its limits. Hunting was a critical lifeline, but never a reliable one. Game was plentiful in some regions, but scarce in others, and settlers, unfamiliar with the land, often struggled. Deer, turkey, and wild fowl supplemented diets. But as settlements grew, overhunting depleted nearby stocks. Families were forced to travel further into the forests, often risking encounters with predators or hostile raids. Moreover, hunting required weapons, powder, and skill resources not every family possessed. Ammunition was expensive and often difficult to replenish. A misfired shot or empty powder horn could mean days without meat. For many, hunting was a supplement, not a solution. Fishing provided steadier returns where rivers, lakes, or coasts were nearby. Cod in New England and shad in the Chesapeake Bay became staples. Indigenous peoples taught settlers techniques for netting and trapping fish, as well as the practice of using fish as fertilizer for corn. These lessons proved life-saving, but even fishing could falter during harsh winters when rivers froze or storms battered coastlines. Indigenous knowledge and crops, perhaps the greatest factor in survival, was the adoption of indigenous crops and farming techniques. Corn, beans, and squash, known as the Three Sisters, formed the foundation of many frontier diets. Corn provided bulk calories, beans restored nitrogen to the soil, and squash offered vital vitamins. Without these staples, many settlements would not have endured. European wheat and barley often failed in the new climates, leaving families dependent on maize. By planting according to native traditions, burying fish with seeds, intercropping beans to climb corn, stalk settlers improved yields dramatically. But these gains came slowly, often after devastating losses had already scarred communities. Famines across the frontier even as colonies matured. Famine returned with grim regularity. In the late 1600s and 1700s, droughts struck the Carolinas and Virginia, leaving families with withered fields. In 1740, the Great Frost in New England destroyed harvests and forced settlers to slaughter livestock they could not feed through the winter. Letters describe families reduced to eating roots, boiled nettles, and whatever scraps could be found. On the western frontier in the late 18th century, pioneers moving into Kentucky and Ohio Valley territories faced similar crises. Travel over the mountains, limited supply lines, and many families depended entirely on what they could grow or hunt locally. When crops failed, malnutrition set in. Children were especially vulnerable. Records from frontier churches reveal waves of child burials in years of famine, testimony to the razor-thin margins of survival. Preservation and scarcity preserving food was essential but difficult. Families salted meat, dried fruit, and smoked fish to last through winters. Root cellars stored potatoes, turnips, and carrots in cool earth. Yet spoilage remained a constant risk. One barrel gone bad could mean weeks without staple food. Rodents and insects raided stores, and without glass jars or modern canning, losses were unavoidable. Milk and dairy provided sustenance in many settlements, but livestock were fragile. Cows and goats required grazing land, shelter, and fodder. Harsh winters killed animals, and predators carried off calves. A single lost cow could cripple a family's food supply. The psychological weight of hunger, perhaps most devastating, was the mental toll of famine. Families lived with the constant awareness that one poor season could erase years of work. Parents rationed their own portions to feed children, often at the cost of their own health. Letters describe mothers watching helplessly as infants wasted away, powerless against hunger. Hunger stripped away illusions of control, revealing the wilderness as an adversary indifferent to human effort. Frontier sermons often reflected this fear. Preachers framed famine as divine punishment or a test of faith. Communities prayed for rain, fasted for deliverance, and interpreted natural cycles as messages from God. The line between spiritual endurance and physical starvation was thin. Communal survival hunger, however, also forged solidarity. Families who survived often did so through cooperation. Shared harvests, communal storage, and barn raisings ensured that no household stood alone. In some towns, families pooled flour and grain to distribute among the most desperate. In others, hunters shared game when neighbors' traps came up empty. This culture of mutual aid became central to frontier identity. While popular myth emphasizes rugged individualism, the reality was far more communal. Hunger taught families that survival often depended not on independence, but interdependence. The thin line of survival stretched across every frontier settlement. Food was never guaranteed. Every year brought new risks: drought, blight, storms, or simple bad luck. For families, the line between life and death was measured in bushels of corn, barrels of flour, or a single successful hunt. And yet, despite the constant specter of famine, families returned year after year. They endured hunger, rebuilt after losses, and passed on the knowledge that had cost so many lives to acquire. Over generations, food systems stabilized, fields grew larger, trade expanded, and surplus replaced desperation. But in the early days of settlement, food was never more than a thin thread, fragile enough to break with one blow of nature's hand. This was the war, fought silently at kitchen hearths and in frozen fields. Families armed not with muskets, but with plows and fishing lines, waging battles against hunger that shaped every decision and defined every settlement. For the frontier, famine was not an occasional disaster. It was the constant adversary that stalked every cabin, every farm, and every family daring to live on the edge of wilderness. For frontier families, hunger was a visible enemy. Disease, by contrast, was an invisible predator that struck without warning and lingered in the shadows of every settlement. It killed silently, spread relentlessly, and often claimed more lives than famine, predators, or hostile raids combined. The wilderness could be cleared, storms could be endured, but disease haunted every cabin, every wagon train, and every settlement on the edge of expansion. Fragile bodies in a harsh world. Without knowledge of microbes or germ theory, illness was often blamed on bad air, divine punishment, or imbalance in the body's humors. Frontier families had little protection against the array of diseases. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly were especially vulnerable. With each westward move, families encountered new climates, new vectors of infection, and new risks. Voyages across the Atlantic had already weakened many emigrants. Crowded ships became breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and measles. Those who survived the journey often arrived malnourished, carrying infections that spread into their new communities. Settlements already strained by food shortages or poor sanitation became ideal incubators. Smallpox, the relentless killer among the most feared diseases, was smallpox. Its symptoms, fever, blistering rashes, and agonizing pain were unmistakable. Mortality rates could reach 30%, and survivors were often left disfigured or blind. In 1633, a smallpox epidemic swept through New England, devastating both colonial and native communities. Accounts describe entire villages of indigenous peoples wiped out within weeks, their populations reduced by more than half. For colonists, the epidemic was both a tragedy and, in their writings, often interpreted as divine providence that cleared land for settlement. Smallpox reappeared in waves throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1721, Boston endured one of its deadliest outbreaks. Over 6,000 residents were infected, nearly half the population. The crisis sparked one of the first major public debates on inoculation in America. Reverend Cotton Mather, influenced by knowledge from enslaved Africans and reports from the Ottoman Empire, advocated for variolation, the deliberate infection with a mild case of smallpox to produce immunity. The practice was controversial, resisted by many, but it marked the beginning of a shift in colonial medicine. On the frontier, however, most families had no access to inoculation, and outbreaks continued to decimate communities. Malaria and the swamp, fevers in the southern colonies. Malaria became a persistent scourge. Carried by mosquitoes in swampy lowlands, the disease brought waves of fever, chills, and weakness that returned year after year. Virginia planters described summers when entire households were bedridden, unable to work fields or tend livestock. The term seasoning came to describe the deadly acclimation period newcomers faced. Many did not survive their first year in malarial regions, though rarely as fatal as smallpox. Malaria drained communities of strength. Repeated bouts left survivors weakened, prone to secondary infections, and unable to maintain the relentless labor frontier life demanded. Families often accepted it as a fact of life, with no cure beyond quinine, which remained scarce and expensive. Cholera, dysentery, and contaminated water, the most essential element of survival, often became a source of sickness. Wells dug too shallow, filled with contaminated runoff. Settlers who drank directly from rivers or ponds risked cholera and dysentery. Both diseases spread rapidly, particularly in crowded frontier forts or wagon camps. Diaries from Western pioneers recount entire groups falling ill within days of drinking foul water. The resulting dehydration and weakness struck hardest at children. Outbreaks were swift and merciless. In some settlements, cholera reduced populations by a third within weeks. Families buried multiple members in single graves, unable to keep pace with the losses. The invisible nature of waterborne disease left many terrified. unsure which spring or stream might carry death. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous encounters with disease. With little or no access to trained midwives or doctors, infections after delivery were common and often fatal. Puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infection, claimed countless lives. One letter from Kentucky in the late 1700s recorded, "We lose more mothers to childbed than to all the perils of the wilderness." Infants, too, faced fragile beginnings. Without vaccines or effective treatments, diseases like measles, whooping cough, and diphtheria swept through families. Infant mortality rates could reach 40% in some regions. Parents came to expect that not all children would survive to adulthood, a grim reality that shaped family life and cultural resilience. Folk remedies and desperate measures. In the absence of professional medicine, families turned to folk remedies. Herbs like willow bark for fevers, garlic for infections, or chamomile for stomach ailments became staples. Indigenous knowledge played a vital role. Settlers learned from native neighbors about plants that could soothe wounds, treat fevers, or ease childbirth. Yet even the most effective remedies had limits. Other treatments, rooted in European tradition, often did more harm than good. Bloodletting, purging, and the application of mercury compounds reflected prevailing medical theories of balancing humors. Families desperate to save loved ones submitted to these practices, with mixed and often tragic results. Epidemics in motion. As settlers moved westward, they carried diseases with them. Wagon trains on the Oregon Trail in the 1840s and 1850s became mobile epidemics. Cholera, in particular, haunted the trail. Estimates suggest that as many as 20,000 migrants died of cholera on the journey west. Graves lined the trail, silent markers of the invisible enemy that followed every step of expansion for indigenous peoples. These moving epidemics were catastrophic, lacking immunity to old world diseases. Tribes along frontier paths were repeatedly devastated by smallpox, measles, and influenza. The demographic collapse of native populations reshaped the balance of power across the continent, often paving the way for settlement at unimaginable human cost. The emotional weight of illness disease did more than kill. It instilled constant fear. Families lived with the knowledge that one cough, one fever, one rash might spread uncontrollably. Parents watched helplessly as children wasted away. Communities prayed for deliverance, interpreting outbreaks as divine wrath or tests of faith. Ministers preached sermons urging repentance, while others called for fasting and prayer. The lack of explanation left people vulnerable, not only physically, but spiritually. Illness also deepened isolation. Families struck by disease often found themselves abandoned by neighbors, fearful of contagion. Quarantine cabins and marked houses became features of frontier life. Survivors carried trauma long after epidemics passed, remembering the silence of empty homes and the stench of mass graves. Toward a fragile resistance over time, knowledge improved. Inoculation against smallpox spread slowly but steadily, reducing mortality where it was practiced. Quinine for malaria became more available, though still costly. By the 19th century, medical schools and rural doctors increased access to more systematic care. Yet, on the frontier, professional help remained distant, often days or weeks away. For most families, the specter of disease never lifted entirely. The war against nature was not only against hunger or storms. It was fought in sickbeds, in fevered cabins, and in hastily dug graves. Disease stalked every frontier family, shaping communities with loss, fear, and resilience. Those who survived carried the memory of epidemics as part of their inheritance. The wilderness could be cleared, and fields could be planted, but the invisible specter of disease remained a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. For frontier families, starvation and disease were killers that could be measured in empty fields and fresh graves. But there was another enemy quieter, more insidious, and just as dangerous. Isolation was the invisible adversary that wore away at minds, spirits, and communities. The wilderness separated families not only by miles of forest or prairie, but by silence, distance, and loneliness that could be as crushing as hunger itself. The distances on the frontier were immense. In New England's early settlements, cabins were sometimes built miles apart, separated by dense woods that made travel hazardous. A family might go weeks without seeing another soul outside their own household. In the back country of Pennsylvania and Virginia, settlements were scattered across valleys and ridges, with neighbors accessible only by trails that became impassable in winter or after heavy rains. On the Great Plains, homesteads established under the Homestead Act of 1862 were often separated by miles of open prairie, where a trip to borrow a tool or share news required hours of walking or riding. For families accustomed to the communal life of European villages where churches, markets, and kin surrounded them, this isolation was a profound shock. Letters from settlers described the silence as overwhelming. One Pennsylvania woman in the mid-1700s wrote, "We hear nothing but the wind and the wolves, and sometimes I fear we are the only people left alive in the world." The absence of familiar sounds human voices, bustling streets left newcomers feeling unmoored, as if they had been exiled not only from their homeland, but from human society itself. The psychological toll of this isolation was significant. Depression, anxiety, and despair were common themes in frontier diaries. Some settlers simply broke under the weight of solitude. In New England, records mention individuals found wandering the woods in confusion after years of separation from community. In the Midwest, 19th century homesteaders referred to prairie madness, a state of mental decline brought on by endless horizons, isolation, and harsh conditions. Symptoms included hallucinations, paranoia, and in extreme cases, violence or suicide. Women were often the most affected, while men occasionally left for hunting, trading, or communal work. Women remained tethered to cabins, responsible for children and daily labor. Accounts describe the suffocating loneliness of long winters spent without visitors. A Kansas homesteader in the 1870s confessed, "I sat day after day with no company but the wind. I would speak aloud to myself just to hear a voice." The burden of childcare, coupled with isolation, made frontier women especially vulnerable to despair. Communication with the outside world was slow and uncertain. Letters to family in Europe or the eastern colonies could take months or even years to arrive. News of births, deaths, or wars often reached settlers long after the events had passed. This delay deepened the sense of disconnection. Many immigrants described the feeling of being cut off from the world, as if they had stepped outside of time itself. Isolation also heightened the fear of danger. A family alone in the wilderness was acutely aware that no help would come if fire consumed their cabin, if wolves attacked their livestock, or if illness struck a child. Diaries are filled with references to the terror of hearing strange noises at night or watching storms gather on the horizon, knowing there was no neighbor close enough to help. The very independence that drew families westward was double-edged. It meant self-reliance, but also abandonment. Religious life became a critical antidote to isolation. Churches, once established, served not only as spiritual centers, but as social lifelines. Families would travel miles to gather for Sunday services, using the occasion to exchange news, share food, and maintain human contact. Circuit rider preachers on the frontier became more than ministers. They were bearers of connection, stitching together scattered households into fragile networks of belonging. Storytelling and music played similar roles inside cabins. Families recited Bible verses, sang hymns, or passed down folk tales as a way to fill the silence and maintain morale. Children grew up listening to the same stories, repeated night after night, their familiarity providing comfort against the vast emptiness outside. These small rituals were not luxuries, but survival strategies, insulating minds against the corrosive effects of solitude. Communities that managed to overcome isolation often did so by building institutions of connection. Barn raisings, quilting bees, and harvest festivals served both practical and social purposes. They reminded settlers that survival was not entirely solitary, that even on the edge of wilderness, bonds of cooperation could form. In the absence of these networks, isolation proved deadly, eroding not just individual spirits, but the resilience of entire families. The war danger of isolation was not confined to psychology. It also had practical consequences. A lone family could not defend itself as effectively as a community. Native raids, bandits, or even wild animal attacks were harder to withstand without neighbors to rally in defense. Isolation meant vulnerability, and vulnerability often meant tragedy. Frontier lore is filled with stories of families wiped out by sudden attacks or disasters, their cabins discovered weeks later by distant neighbors who had been unaware of their suffering. Yet despite these dangers, isolation also forged qualities that became central to frontier identity. Self-reliance, resilience, and stoic endurance were sharpened in solitude. Families learned to improvise, repair, and adapt without outside assistance. They valued every visit, every letter, and every gathering with an intensity that only scarcity could produce. The very loneliness that crushed some became, for others, a crucible that hardened their determination to endure. As frontier settlements expanded and towns grew, isolation slowly diminished. Roads connected cabins to villages, post offices brought letters more regularly, and schools became hubs of social life. But in the early generations of expansion, before these institutions took root, isolation remained a silent enemy. It killed not with hunger or fever, but with despair, and its scars lingered in the memories of those who survived. The silent war with nature was not fought only against visible threats. It was fought within the human mind in the long winters, in the miles of forest between cabins, in the absence of familiar voices. Isolation was the invisible adversary that reminded every frontier family that survival meant not only feeding the body, but protecting the soul. For frontier families, survival was never measured in years alone, but in the fragile span of days and hours that marked the beginning of life. Nowhere was this more evident than in childbirth. On the edge of the wilderness, every pregnancy was a gamble, and every delivery was a crossing between life and death. In cabins built from rough-hewn logs, far from doctors or midwives, women gave birth with only family or neighbors to assist them. The risks were enormous, and the outcomes often tragic. The peril of childbirth in the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death among women. The frontier magnified those dangers. Without trained medical attendants, sterile instruments, or access to hospitals, women faced complications that often proved fatal. Prolonged labor, breech births, and postpartum hemorrhage could kill within hours, even when deliveries seemed successful. Infections, what doctors later called puerperal fever, claimed countless mothers days after childbirth. Letters and journals reveal the stark realities. A Kentucky settler in the 1780s recorded, "My wife was taken in labor at night. We had no midwife, no doctor. By morning, she and the child were both dead." Such accounts were not exceptions, but common tragedies that families on the frontier braced themselves to face. Infant mortality, even when mothers survived. Infants were desperately vulnerable. The first weeks of life were the most perilous. Without vaccinations or effective treatments, diseases like measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and pneumonia spread swiftly among newborns. Malnutrition and exposure compounded the risk. In some settlements, nearly half of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. Gravestones from frontier cemeteries bear silent testimony, rows of tiny markers inscribed with names and dates, often no more than a few months apart. Families might bury multiple infants within a single year. Parents learned to live with grief as a constant companion, balancing joy at new births with the dread of likely loss. The cabin as maternity warden, like the urban centers of Europe, where midwives were common, frontier births took place in the home. Usually in the main cabin room, space was limited, light poor, and conditions far from sterile. Bedding was laid on wooden floors, while fires were stoked to keep the room warm through long nights of labor. Family members, husbands, older children, or nearby women, guided only by experience or traditional knowledge. When midwives were available, their role was invaluable. These women, often respected figures in frontier communities, carried herbal remedies, knowledge of delivery techniques, and emotional strength. But even skilled midwives could do little against complications beyond their control. Their presence improved survival rates, but mortality remained high. Cultural and religious responses communities framed childbirth and infant death through religious lenses. Ministers preached that survival or loss was part of God's will, and many families found comfort in faith. Baptisms were often performed within hours of birth, reflecting the fear that infants might not live long enough for formal ceremonies. Gravestones frequently bore inscriptions of hope. safe in the arms of Jesus or gone to be an angel. At the same time, families developed rituals of mourning that reflected the emotional toll. Funerals for infants were deeply personal, often attended only by family and close neighbors. Mothers, in particular, carried grief silently, expected to return quickly to household labor and childcare for surviving children. Yet diaries reveal their anguish. A New England woman wrote in 1762, "I held him but 1 week, then the Lord took him. My arms feel empty still." The burden on women for women, the cycle of pregnancy and loss was relentless. Large families were common, not only because children were needed for labor, but because so many did not survive. A woman might endure a dozen pregnancies, with only half her children reaching adulthood. This constant physical and emotional strain shortened lifespans and left many widowers raising children alone on the frontier. Women's resilience was tested daily. They faced childbirth without medical care, nursed sick infants through epidemics, and buried their own children in soil barely tilled for crops. Their labor, both physical and emotional, was the backbone of family survival. Yet their suffering was often unrecorded except in passing lines of family, letters, or church records. Epidemics and infant and child deaths were not confined to the newborn stage. Epidemics swept through frontier settlements with terrifying speed. In 1735, a diphtheria outbreak in New England, remembered as the throat distemper, killed thousands of children. Families lost multiple siblings within days. One minister recorded burying 2, 3, 4, sometimes 6 children from one household in the 19th century. On western trails, measles and cholera devastated wagon trains. Families traveling west buried children in unmarked graves along the route, often too fearful of attacks or too exhausted to linger. The Oregon Trail alone claimed the lives of thousands of young children, their stories largely lost, except for brief mentions in journals. Coping with loss. Frequency of child death shaped cultural attitudes. Parents were advised not to grow too attached to infants until they had survived their first year. Yet love and grief could not be so easily restrained. Poems, songs, and keepsakes of hair, embroidered samplers, or small carved toys became ways of remembering children who lived only briefly. Communities rallied around grieving families, offering food, labor, and comfort. Yet grief was often borne privately, particularly by women. In many cases, silence about loss became its own form of endurance, a way to keep moving forward in the face of repeated tragedy. Legacy of resilience, despite the constant shadow of death. Families continued to grow. Children who survived became the heart of frontier communities, learning survival skills from an early age and carrying forward the resilience born of loss. Mothers and fathers, hardened by grief, instilled determination in those who remain. Every surviving child represented not only personal hope, but the survival of entire settlements in time. Improvements in medicine, sanitation, and nutrition reduced maternal and infant mortality. Midwifery became more professionalized, and eventually, hospitals provided safer conditions for childbirth. But on the frontier, long before such advances reached the edges of settlement, every birth remained a dangerous threshold, and every child's first cry was a fragile promise rather than a guarantee. The frontier was shaped as much by death as by survival. Cabins were both homes and places of mourning, where families greeted new life and buried it in the same breath. For those who endured, the losses became part of their story, silent, painful, but inseparable from the history of the wilderness they tried to tame. For frontier families, the wilderness was not empty, it was alive with creatures whose presence could mean danger, fear, and sudden death. Wolves, bears, cougars, and other predators lurked beyond the flickering light of cabin fires. Their howls and growls, a nightly reminder that survival was never secure. Predators at the door were more than animals. They symbolized the untamed power of nature that settlers could never fully control. Wolves were among the most feared. Packs prowled the forests of New England, the Great Lakes, and the plains. At night, their howls carried for miles, chilling families who lay awake in their cabins. Wolves rarely attacked humans directly, but they preyed on livestock, the most valuable possession of frontier families. A single wolf raid could kill sheep, calves, or poultry, destroying months of labor. Farmers recorded rising in the morning to find barns torn open and animals carried off. In some regions, bounties were placed on wolves, encouraging settlers to hunt them systematically. Wolf hunts became communal events, with neighbors gathering to drive packs from settlements. Yet, despite such efforts, the sound of wolves remained a constant in the frontier soundscape, a haunting reminder of vulnerability. Bears represented a different kind of threat. Black bears were common across much of North America, while grizzlies dominated the western ranges. These massive animals posed dangers not only to livestock, but to people themselves. Bears raided cornfields, overturned barrels of grain, and ripped into smokehouses for meat. Confrontations could be deadly. Accounts from Kentucky and the Ohio Valley describe men mauled while hunting or women attacked while tending crops. Grizzly encounters in the Rocky Mountains terrified even seasoned trappers, who called them the most formidable beasts of the wilderness. For families, the possibility of a bear appearing near their homestead meant that vigilance was constant. Children were warned never to wander far, and men kept muskets close at hand when working fields. Cougars, often called panthers or mountain lions, sated to the sense of unease. Silent, fast, and elusive, they were rarely seen until the moment of attack. They targeted livestock, but also sometimes children. Folklore across the frontier told of panthers stalking women on forest paths or screaming in the night with cries said to resemble human voices. These stories, rooted in genuine encounters, heightened fear. Families felt that the wilderness itself could leap from the shadows, embodied in a predator that could strike without warning. Smaller predators also exacted a heavy toll. Foxes raided chicken coops, raccoons plundered cornfields, and wildcats threatened piglets. While not life-threatening to humans, these animals chipped away at fragile food supplies. Every lost chicken or lamb represented not only economic loss, but reduced chances of surviving the winter. For settlers living at the edge of famine, such raids could be devastating. Beyond the physical danger, predators carried symbolic weight. 2 European settlers, wolves and bears, had long been associated with savagery, chaos, and the wild. Their presence reinforced the sense that the frontier was an alien world, untamed and hostile. Folklore turned these animals into villains, while victories over them became proof of human courage and dominion. Families often displayed wolf pelts or bear skins as trophies, tangible evidence of survival in the face of danger. Predator threats also influenced community organization. Families living in isolation were far more vulnerable. Barns and fields needed to be guarded, and livestock penned securely at night. When possible, settlers clustered homesteads or built stockades. Neighbors banded together to track predators, turning hunts into both defense and social ritual. In this way, the presence of wolves and bears shaped not only daily routines, but also patterns of settlement and cooperation. Native American perspectives on predators added another layer of meaning. Many tribes respected wolves and bears as powerful spiritual beings. Wolves symbolized loyalty, hunting skill, and family bonds. Bears represented strength and healing. Indigenous practices often avoided needless killing of these animals, emphasizing balance with nature rather than eradication. Settlers, however, viewed predators almost exclusively as enemies to be destroyed. This cultural difference reflected deeper contrasts in diaries describe sleepless nights, listening to wolves circling cabins, or the terror of hearing livestock scream in the dark. Parents feared for children walking to distant fields or fetching water alone. Stories of attacks spread quickly, sometimes exaggerated, but always effective in stoking fear. Over time, these anxieties became woven into the fabric of frontier folklore tales of giant wolves, demon-like panthers, or monstrous bears that blurred the line between fact and legend. Predators also shaped gender roles on the frontier. Men were expected to defend homesteads with muskets and traps, proving their ability to protect family and property. Women, often alone, when men hunted or traveled, stories survive of women driving off wolves with firebrands or killing bears with axes when caught unprepared. Such episodes became part of the mythology of frontier toughness, though behind them lay real fear and desperation. Over time, the advance of settlement reduced predator populations. Forests were cleared, livestock numbers grew, and systematic hunts decimated wolf and bear populations in many regions. By the early 19th century, wolves were largely eliminated from New England, and bear sightings became rare east of the Appalachians. But in the Western Territories, grizzlies and cougars continued to remind pioneers that the wilderness still held dangers beyond their control. Predators at the door were not constant killers, but their presence shaped every decision of frontier life. Families built stronger fences, kept watch at night, and organized communities around shared defense. More than famine or storms, predators symbolized the sense of being surrounded by an environment that resisted human settlement. They were the visible embodiment of nature's hostility, creatures that reminded every family that the frontier was never truly safe. 4 generations raised in Europe's crowded villages and farms, facing down wolves or bears was a return to primal fears. It reinforced the feeling that the frontier was not just land to be claimed, but a battleground between civilization and wilderness. Victories over predators provided reassurance that progress was possible, that the wilderness could be subdued. Yet the memory of howls in the night or sudden attacks lingered, a reminder that nature was never far from reclaiming what settlers had carved from its domain. The silent war with nature was fought in many ways, with plows against soil, with axes against forests, with faith against despair. But against predators, it was fought with vigilance, courage, and constant fear. Wolves, bears, and cougars did not only threaten lives, they threatened the fragile sense of security that families clung to. Every howl, every shadow at the edge of the firelight was a reminder that the frontier was never conquered, only endured. The wilderness tested frontier families, not only through hunger, disease, and predators, but through forces of nature that could sweep away years of labor in a single night. Fire and storms, unpredictable, violent, and impossible to control, were the most terrifying expressions of nature's wrath. For those who lived in fragile cabins on isolated homesteads, there was no defense against a lightning strike, a wall of water, or a roaring blizzard. Each disaster left scars on memory and land alike, reminders that survival was always contingent on the mercy of the elements. Fire was a constant threat in frontier settlements. Cabins were built of dry logs, roofs often thatched with straw, and hearths burned day and night for warmth and cooking. A stray spark could ignite a home within moments, spreading flames too quickly to contain. Families kept buckets of water at the ready, but once a blaze began, there was little chance of saving the structure. Entire barns, filled with precious grain or hay, were lost in single accidents, plunging families into starvation risks for the coming winter. In isolated areas, neighbors might not even be close enough to respond before everything was consumed. Wildfires posed even greater danger. On the prairies and in the forests, fire could move with terrifying speed, driven by wind across miles of grass or timber. Settlers described skies blackened with smoke, animals fleeing in terror, and walls of flame advancing faster than horses could outrun. A Wisconsin pioneer recalled in 1871 the tornado of fire that swept through the town of Peshtigo, destroying thousands of lives in what became the deadliest wildfire in American history. Though such massive fires were rare, smaller blazes still threatened families every dry season. For those who survived, the memory of fire was seared into consciousness as the most uncontrollable of frontier dangers. Storms brought their own forms of destruction. In coastal regions, hurricanes struck without mercy, sinking ships, tearing apart wharves, and flattening crops. The hurricane of 1775 devastated communities along the New England coast, destroying harvests and leaving survivors to starve in its aftermath. In the southern colonies, storms swept through with torrential rain and winds strong enough to level entire settlements. Families who had fought to clear land and build homes saw their work erased in a single night of chaos. Inland, tornadoes represented nature's most sudden and violent threat. The Great Plains, opened to settlers in the 19th century, lay directly in the path of Tornado Alley. With little warning, funnel clouds descended, ripping apart cabins, uprooting trees, and scattering livestock across the prairie. Survivors often described the sound as a roar louder than any cannon. For families caught in the open, there was no defense but to pray as walls collapsed around them. Afterward, the landscape was often unrecognizable, barns gone, fences erased, and fields flattened in swaths of destruction. Winter storms were equally deadly. In northern settlements, Blizzards trapped families for days or weeks. Snow piled against cabin doors until exits were blocked and livestock perished in frozen barns. Without sufficient wood, families risked freezing to death. Diaries recount desperate measures, burning furniture for heat, slaughtering animals early, or rationing food until spring. In 1888, the schoolhouse blizzard of the Dakota Territory killed over 200 people, many of them children caught on their way home from rural schools when a sudden storm swept across the plains. Stories like these became grim reminders of how quickly a routine day could turn into tragedy. Floods followed storms with equal ferocity. Rivers, swollen by rain or snowmelt, overflowed, washing away fields and drowning livestock. Settlements near the Mississippi and Ohio rivers were particularly vulnerable. Families lost not only crops, but homes swept from their foundations. Floodwaters carried disease, spreading cholera and dysentery in their wake. Survivors often faced hunger and illness even after the water receded. The destruction of stores and livestock, leaving them destitute. Thunderstorms, while common, could be terrifying on the open frontier. With no tall buildings or urban structures to draw lightning, cabins and barns often took direct strikes. Fires ignited instantly, sometimes killing entire families as flames consumed wooden structures in the middle of the night. The booming of thunder and flash of lightning in isolated areas carried psychological weight as well. Settlers often described storms in religious terms, interpreting them as divine warnings or punishments. Preachers used the fury of storms to remind communities of their smallness before God's power for children. The memory of storms often lasted a lifetime. In memoirs written decades later, survivors described huddling under blankets while roofs lifted or rain poured through cracks in cabins. Fear of storms shaped the rhythms of frontier life, influencing where homes were built and how communities responded to signs of changing weather. Families scanned the horizon constantly, learning to read shifts in wind, the buildup of clouds, or sudden silences in bird calls as omens of disaster. Despite the devastation, frontier families adapted where they could. Fire breaks were cut into prairies to halt the spread of flames. Cabins were sometimes dug partly into the earth to withstand storms. Communities built levees and dikes along rivers, though these often failed under extreme floods. Families learned to stockpile food and wood in preparation for long winters, building resilience through necessity. Yet even the best precautions offered no guarantee. The scale of nature's fury could always overwhelm human defenses. The emotional impact of disasters was profound. Survivors often carried trauma long after storms passed. Families who had lost homes or children to fire or blizzards spoke of fear returning every time skies darkened or winds rose. Communities rebuilt again and again, but scars of loss remained. Folk songs, sermons, and local legends remembered the great fires, floods, and storms, passing warnings down through generations. Nature's wrath became part of the cultural memory of the frontier, shaping how families viewed themselves and their place in the wilderness. In some cases, disasters forged community solidarity. Neighbors gathered to help rebuild barns after fires, share food after floods, or search for the lost after blizzards. Out of destruction, bonds of resilience were formed. But disasters also reminded families of their vulnerability, underscoring that no amount of labor could secure permanence in a land where storms and fires could erase everything in hours. The war with nature was not only a matter of daily endurance, but of sudden, catastrophic blows. Fire, wind, water, and ice were adversaries that no musket or plow could master. For families who survived, every storm passed was both a victory and a reminder that their struggle was unending. The wilderness could not be conquered. Life on the frontier demanded constant labor. Every acre of land had to be cleared, every cabin raised by hand, every fence built log by log. The work was unending, and the tools were simple: axes, saws, plows, and bare hands. There were no machines to ease the burden, no nearby blacksmiths to replace broken parts, and no doctors when accidents turned deadly. Tools were lifelines, but in the wilderness they were also weapons of risk. A single slip of the axe or fall from a roof could cripple a family's chance of survival. Clearing land was often the first and most punishing task. Dense forests stretched across the eastern frontier, and each farmstead began as an ocean of trees. Men spent weeks chopping, felling, and dragging timber. Stumps had to be dug out with shovels or burned in place, roots hacked apart with mattocks. The sound of axes echoed through valleys, day after day, as families transformed wilderness into fields. The labor was exhausting and often dangerous. Falling trees crushed men who miscalculated their cuts, and sharp axes caused deep wounds that could not be properly treated. Infections set in quickly, turning minor injuries into fatal ones. Once trees were down, the timber became both resource and burden. Logs were stacked into cabins, barns, and fences. Families often relied on neighbors for raising days when entire communities gathered to lift walls into place. These events symbolized cooperation but carried risks. With no cranes or machinery, logs weighing hundreds of pounds were balanced by sheer human strength. Falls, broken bones, and crushed limbs were common. In settlements far from doctors, such injuries often meant permanent disability or death. Agricultural labor added its own dangers. Wooden plows, drawn by oxen or horses, broke frequently in rocky soil. Farmers bent their bodies to the rhythm of digging, hoeing, and planting from dawn until dusk. Blisters hardened into calluses, but deeper injuries from overworked strained backs. Twisted joints and hernias were constant. With no relief or medical care, these injuries became lifelong burdens. For women, daily labor was no less punishing. Grinding corn by hand, hauling water, carrying firewood, and tending gardens demanded endless physical strength. Even simple domestic tasks risked burns, cuts, or falls in cramped cabins. The absence of skilled craftsmen compounded hardship. A broken axe handle or snapped plow blade could halt work for weeks. Families often improvised, carving new handles, reshaping metal, or relying on crude substitutes. Blacksmiths, when present, were vital figures in communities, but many families lived days away from the nearest forge. Improvised repairs became part of survival, and the ability to mend tools was as important as knowing how to use them. The frontier made every tool precious. An axe, well cared for, could mean the difference between a farm that survived and one that failed. Settlers sharpened blades obsessively, storing them away from dampness to prevent rust. When tools were lost or stolen, families suffered crippling setbacks. Accounts survive of desperate settlers traveling dozens of miles simply to borrow an axe or saw, their survival hinging on a single piece of iron. Yet, for all their value, tools also caused terror. Medical records from frontier doctors, where they existed, list axe wounds, crushed limbs, and burns as leading causes of death after disease. With no anesthesia and little understanding of infection, amputations were crude and painful. Many families faced impossible decisions, whether to attempt saving a wounded man at home or risk a days-long journey to find a doctor. Too often, neither choice succeeded. The emotional toll of constant labor was immense. Families rose before dawn and worked until darkness, their days measured in the rhythm of chopping, hauling, and digging. Children were pressed into service as soon as they could walk, fetching water, feeding animals, and carrying wood. Childhood, as remembered in later memoirs, was defined less by play than by toil. The burden was not only physical but mental, as families lived with the awareness that falling behind in labor could mean starvation in winter. Despite the hardships, labor also created bonds. Raising barns together, repairing tools in shared forges, or harvesting fields collectively forged a sense of community. Mutual dependence softened the isolation of frontier life. A broken plow might be repaired by a neighbor. An injured farmer might see his fields planted by others in the settlement. These traditions of shared labor became part of the cultural fabric, remembered with pride by later generations as examples of resilience and solidarity. Tools also carried symbolic weight. The axe, in particular, became an emblem of the frontier spirit. Politicians and writers of the 19th century celebrated it as the tool that conquered the wilderness, transforming forests into farms and cabins. Yet, behind the symbolism lay the reality: endless labor, calloused hands, and lives cut short by accidents. The myth of the axe as a symbol of progress obscured the suffering that accompanied its swing. Women's tools, though less celebrated, were equally vital. Spinning wheels, looms, and butter churns sustained households just as surely as axes and plows. These tools represented the hidden labor of women, whose work inside cabins kept families alive through winters. Burns from open hearths, injuries from knives, and exhaustion from ceaseless chores marked their bodies as visibly as the blisters of men in the fields. Their tools, too, were lifelines, and their absence could mean hunger or hardship. The frontier was a place where every tool extended human strength, but also revealed human fragility. Empty hands through loss, breakage, or injury meant vulnerability. Families lived with the knowledge that they could not afford mistakes. A dropped axe, a splintered plow, or a broken wheel might set in motion a chain of losses leading to ruin. Tools were not conveniences, but extensions of life itself, binding survival to iron and wood in the struggle against wilderness. The silent war with nature was fought as much with tools as with courage. Axes, plows, and hands carved the frontier inch by inch, but every swing carried risk. For families who endured, their labor left scars on the land and on their own bodies. The wilderness yielded, but at a terrible cost measured in sweat, blood, and the tools that turned empty forests into fragile homes. On the frontier, survival was a daily struggle against hunger, storms, disease, and predators. Yet beyond the physical battles, families also fought wars of the spirit. When food ran out, when children sickened, when storms tore roofs from cabins, reason alone could not sustain them. In moments when human effort failed, families turned to faith and superstition. Belief became as essential as bread, a source of strength, hope, and explanation in a world that often seemed indifferent to human suffering. Religion was central to most frontier families. Whether Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania, or Baptists and Methodists in the southern backcountry, faith was carried westward with every wagon and planted alongside every crop. For many, the wilderness itself was interpreted in biblical terms, the promised land to be claimed, or a testing ground like the desert of Exodus. Ministers urged settlers to see their hardships as trials sent by God, designed to refine and strengthen them. Faith provided meaning to suffering, turning starvation and disease into spiritual lessons rather than random cruelty. The church, when established, was more than a spiritual home. It was the heart of social life, a place where scattered families gathered after weeks of isolation. Even before towns had schools or courthouses, they raised churches, often simple log structures with dirt floors and wooden benches. Preachers, especially circuit riders, in the 18th and 19th centuries, traveled vast distances to bring sermons to scattered households. Their presence reminded families they were not alone, binding communities through shared rituals of prayer, baptism, and worship. Yet faith was not only organized. Families also turned to personal devotion, daily prayers, scripture readings, and hymns sung by candlelight-filled cabins with words of hope. Parents taught children to memorize verses, not just as moral lessons, but as shields against despair. When storms shook walls or wolves howled nearby, settlers recited psalms for protection. In diaries, mothers often wrote that prayer was the only comfort left when medicine, food, and strength failed. But alongside formal religion, superstition flourished. On the frontier, where science was limited and explanations scarce, families clung to folk beliefs inherited from Europe or learned from indigenous neighbors. Charms were carried against evil spirits. Iron nails were driven into door frames to ward off misfortune. Some believed that a horseshoe above the door protected cabins from lightning. Others mixed rituals with remedies, burying a lock of a sick child's hair under a tree to draw out fever, or placing Bibles under pillows to keep away nightmares. Superstition was not merely ignorance. It was an attempt to impose order on a world of chaos. When crops failed, families searched for omens or sins that might have provoked divine anger. Strange animal behavior, sudden illnesses, or unusual weather were read as signs of coming misfortune. In the absence of doctors and reliable forecasts, these interpretations offered a sense of control, however fragile. The blend of faith and superstition often created unique frontier rituals. During droughts, families organized prayer meetings, fasting for rain. If storms became destructive, some communities rang church bells to chase away thunder and lightning. Mothers tied red strings around babies' wrists to protect them from sickness, while fathers carried talismans when hunting or traveling alone. Such practices, while unscientific, eased anxieties and gave people the courage to face dangers beyond their control. The reliance on faith was not without conflict. Different denominations clashed over interpretations of suffering. Puritans emphasized discipline and covenant, while Methodists focused on emotional revival and personal salvation. Disputes arose in small communities where competing churches vied for members. Yet these rivalries underscored how deeply belief mattered. Faith was not an afterthought, but a lifeline in the wilderness. Superstition sometimes drew suspicion or condemnation from religious leaders. Ministers warned against charms and folk rituals, condemning them as remnants of paganism or witchcraft. But many families held to both prayer and superstition, seeing no contradiction. For them, survival demanded every resource, whether it came from scripture, ritual, or tradition. In times of mass crisis, faith and superstition shaped collective responses. During epidemics, families prayed for deliverance, but also avoided neighbors they believed cursed or unlucky. Storms that destroyed crops were sometimes explained as divine judgment on sin, prompting communities to repent or reform. At other times, survival itself was interpreted as proof of divine favor, strengthening confidence and perseverance. The psychological power of belief cannot be overstated. Hope, even when rooted in superstition, gave families strength to continue when logic might have told them to abandon the struggle. Faith turned meaningless tragedy into sacrifice, despair into endurance, and isolation into communion with something larger than themselves. Without it, many may have lacked the will to persist. At the same time, belief systems reflected the contradictions of frontier life. Families who prayed for God's protection also feared witches, spirits, or curses. Communities that built churches also whispered about omens in the woods or ghosts along trails. This blending of the sacred and the superstitious created a unique cultural landscape, half rooted in scripture, half in folklore. Over generations, these traditions left a deep imprint. The revival movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, shaped by frontier preachers, influenced American religious identity for centuries to come. Folk beliefs, though often dismissed later, carried forward in superstitions that linger even today. The faith and rituals of frontier families were more than coping mechanisms. They were cultural foundations born of necessity in a world of endless uncertainty. The silent war with nature was fought not only with tools and labor, but with prayers, charms, and hope. Faith gave settlers the courage to face another day of hunger or storms. Superstition offered explanations when reason fell silent. Together, they were invisible weapons in the battle for survival. On the frontier, belief was not luxury, it was survival itself. On the frontier, isolation was deadly. Families scattered across forests, valleys, and plains quickly learned that survival was not a solitary task. No matter how strong or resourceful, no household could endure every hardship alone. Storms destroyed barns, wolves stole livestock, epidemics swept through cabins, and crops failed without warning. In these moments, neighbors became lifelines. Yet trust was fragile, and strangers could represent either salvation or danger. Frontier communities were built on a delicate balance between cooperation and suspicion, forged in the crucible of constant need. The earliest settlements often began with only a handful of families. They clustered along rivers, near springs, or at the edge of clearings, relying on proximity for mutual support. Barn raisings, corn huskings, and quilting bees became essential rituals where work and social life blended. These gatherings were more than chores, they were survival strategies. Raising the heavy walls of a barn or harvesting acres of corn could not be done by one family alone. Communities measured their strength in how quickly neighbors responded to one another's needs. In these shared labors, bonds of trust grew, yet the fragility of such communities was always apparent. Families might live days apart, separated by rivers or forests. News traveled slowly, and a cabin could burn down or a family starve before neighbors even knew help was needed. Suspicion sometimes festered in these gaps of communication. Strangers arriving on horseback might be welcomed with food and shelter, or they might be met with rifles at the door. The wilderness bred both hospitality and fear, for no one could be certain whether visitors were friends, thieves, or worse, religious and cultural differences added further tensions. Settlers from Germany, Ireland, England, and Scandinavia carried their own traditions, languages, and denominations into the wilderness. In some regions, shared faith smoothed divisions. In others, disputes over church leadership, land boundaries, or farming methods tore small settlements apart. Ministers sometimes served as mediators, but quarrels could simmer for years, undermining the very cooperation on which survival depended. Trade and bartering formed another fragile thread of community. Frontier families often lacked cash and relied on exchanging goods and labor. One family might trade corn for venison, or a day of plowing for a repaired wagon wheel. These exchanges wove networks of obligation, but they also bred resentment when debts went unpaid. Diaries record disputes over borrowed tools never returned or livestock not replaced. Disputes that escalated into feuds lasting generations. In places where law courts were distant, justice often became personal. Despite the risks, cooperation remained essential. Neighbors gathered for militia musters, forming defensive bands against raids or bandits. Families pooled food during lean winters, ensuring that no child starved while others had enough. When epidemics struck, some communities organized rotations to care for the sick and bury the dead. These acts of solidarity reflected not only compassion but the recognition that misfortune could strike any household next. To neglect a neighbor today might mean abandonment. Tomorrow, strangers arriving on the frontier were especially uncertain figures. Some were welcomed as valuable additions, bringing new skills or extra hands for harvests. Others were viewed as intruders, competing for land or resources. Settlements often balanced between hope and suspicion, offering food to travelers but watching them closely. Stories spread of wandering peddlers or drifters who turned to theft or violence, fueling fears of outsiders. In such an environment, hospitality was both a virtue and a gamble. Native peoples added another layer of complexity. Relationships varied dramatically across regions and eras. Some settlers forged alliances, trading food and knowledge that sustained entire colonies. Others lived in constant fear of raids or reprisal for encroaching on indigenous land. Misunderstandings, broken treaties, and violence often destroyed fragile trust, leaving frontier families caught in cycles of fear and retaliation. For settlers, indigenous neighbors could be both indispensable teachers and feared adversaries, a contradiction that defined much of frontier life. Women often served as bridges between households, carrying news, sharing recipes, or assisting in childbirth. Their informal networks spread information faster than letters or official channels, creating webs of connection across scattered cabins. These bonds were crucial in times of crisis, when word of an approaching storm, outbreak, or threat traveled through whispered warnings rather than official proclamations. In many cases, women's labor and communication held fragile communities together more securely than men's militias or councils. Children, too, became agents of connection. Shared schooling, when it was possible, brought families together. A log schoolhouse might serve only a dozen children, but it represented the determination of neighbors to pool resources for a collective future. Teachers were often paid in food or labor rather than money, reflecting the communal sacrifices required to educate the next generation. Even these small institutions were fragile, closing when crops demanded labor or when families moved westward in search of better land. Disasters tested communities most severely. Fires, floods, and epidemics forced settlements to decide whether to rally or fragment. Some rose to the challenge, gathering resources to rebuild barns or tend to the sick. Others disintegrated under pressure, as fear and suspicion drove families apart. Letters from the Ohio Valley in the late 18th century described towns where no man trusts another, and every family watches its own fence alone. Fragility was not just material, but social, as mistrust could kill as surely as hunger. Despite these weaknesses, the idea of community remained powerful. Settlers celebrated their ability to endure, not just as individuals, but as part of collective efforts. Folklore and memory often emphasized the moments of solidarity. Neighbors raising barns in a day, fighting off wolves together, or harvesting crops before a storm. These stories became part of the frontier identity, shaping later generations' understanding of how survival had been won. Yet beneath the legends, the reality remained complex. Communities could be both supportive and treacherous, neighbors both allies and rivals. Strangers could arrive as saviors or threats. In a world where survival balanced on thin margins, trust itself was fragile, hard-won, easily broken, and always necessary. The wilderness may have demanded self-reliance, but it also demanded cooperation, and the tension between the two defined the lives of frontier families. The silent war with nature was never fought alone. Every cabin, every family, every settlement depended on neighbors and strangers alike. Communities rose and fell on fragile bonds of trust, reminding settlers that endurance required not only strength of body, but strength of relationship. In the wilderness, survival was not simply individual, it was shared, negotiated, and constantly tested. On the frontier, survival often depended on strength of arms and the swing of an axe. But beyond the fields and hunting grounds, inside cabins and within communities, it was women who carried burdens that were just as heavy. Their labor rarely entered history books, yet it sustained families through famine, sickness, storms, and loss. Women of the frontier were silent pillars, holding homes together, raising children in uncertainty, and enduring hardships with resilience that often determined whether families survived or failed. The daily work of frontier women began before dawn and ended long after nightfall. Cooking was itself an ordeal. Meals were prepared over open hearths, where accidents could cause burns or even death. Bread was baked without ovens, often in cast iron pots buried in coals. Corn had to be ground by hand, vegetables preserved in salt, and meat smoked to last through the winter. Each step required labor and vigilance, for one mistake could waste food too precious to spare. In addition to cooking, women managed an unending cycle of domestic tasks. They hauled water from streams or wells, chopped wood for fires, spun yarn, wove cloth, and sewed clothing. Every shirt, dress, and blanket was produced by hand, often from wool or flax raised and processed on the farm. Soap was made by boiling animal fat with lye candles from tallow. These chores were not optional luxuries, but daily necessities. The absence of a single candle could plunge a cabin into dangerous darkness during long winters, and the lack of warm clothing could mean frostbite for children. Child rearing consumed equal energy. Families were large, and infant mortality was high. Mothers nursed children, treated fevers with herbal remedies, and watched over them during epidemics that struck with merciless speed. Even as women tended newborns, they labored in fields or gardens, infants tied to their backs or laid in makeshift cradles nearby. Older children joined in chores as soon as they could walk, but the weight of responsibility fell on mothers to ensure survival at every stage of childhood. Women were also healers. In the absence of doctors, they relied on folk medicine, often blending European traditions with indigenous knowledge. They brewed teas from willow bark to ease pain, poultices from herbs to heal wounds, and syrups from roots to fight coughs. Midwives, nearly always women, guided childbirth with skills passed down through generations. Their knowledge often meant the difference between life and death, both for mothers and infants. Yet even these skills had limits, and many women buried their own children while tending to others. Frontier women carried emotional burdens as well. They endured long stretches of isolation when men traveled to hunt, trade, or fight in militias. They defended cabins alone, sometimes with muskets in hand, against predators or intruders. Diaries reveal the weight of fear. Women listening to wolves outside, nursing sick children without hope of help, or watching crops fail while husbands were absent. Their resilience was often silent, unsplattered, but indispensable. When disaster struck, women's strength was tested most. Fires that destroyed cabins left families homeless. It was often women who gathered children, salvaged what they could, and organized rebuilding. During famines, mothers rationed their own portions to feed children, sometimes wasting away themselves. In letters, women wrote of burying infants in frozen soil, then returning to work the same day because survival demanded it. Their grief was private, their endurance public. Beyond domestic life, women contributed directly to economic survival. They managed gardens that supplied essential vegetables, tended chickens and milk cows, and produced butter, cheese, and eggs for trade. In many communities, women's labor provided the goods that could be exchanged for tools or salt. When men died, younger common fate on the frontier widows often assumed full responsibility for farms, proving that women's work extended far beyond the household. Some women gained reputations for extraordinary resilience. In frontier legends, widows defended cabins alone, reaping harvests while raising children, or traveling hundreds of miles to establish new homesteads. These stories, though sometimes romanticized, reflected real struggles faced by countless unnamed women. Their ability to adapt, endure, and sustain communities was a quiet force that shaped frontier history as much as any battle or treaty. Religious and cultural expectations added weight to their roles. Women were expected to embody piety, modesty, and submission, even as survival demanded independence and strength. Ministers praised them as keepers of virtue, while families relied on them as tireless laborers. This contradiction defined women's lives, praised for domestic devotion while carrying burdens equal to and often heavier than those of men. Despite restrictions, women forged networks of support. They gathered at quilting bees, shared recipes, and exchanged remedies. These gatherings, though often portrayed as social pastimes, were vital spaces of solidarity. Here, women shared grief, celebrated survival, and built friendships that sustained them through isolation. In communities where men's politics and militias often fractured, women's quiet cooperation helped preserve unity. The legacy of frontier women is visible in the survival of communities that might otherwise have collapsed. Their work left little written record, but their endurance is inscribed in the farms that endured, the children who grew to adulthood, and the traditions carried forward. The image of the rugged frontiersman with axe and rifle obscures the reality that without the labor of women cooking, sewing, healing, and enduring settlements could not have survived. Women of the frontier were not only silent pillars, but also architects of resilience. Their strength was measured not in battles fought, but in meals cooked, fevers soothed, and children raised amid endless hardship. They bore the weight of a wilderness that demanded everything, and they carried it with unrecorded courage. Their legacy is not in monuments or battles, but in survival itself. Childhood on the frontier was unlike anything imagined in the towns and villages of Europe or the growing cities of the American colonies. For frontier children, life was a blend of relentless labor, constant danger, and rare moments of play snatched between chores. They grew up in cabins where death was familiar, where storms and predators were daily threats, and where survival depended on their contributions almost as soon as they could walk. These children of the wilderness were not merely bystanders in the frontier story, they were essential actors in their families. Fight to endure. From the earliest years, children were immersed in work. At 3 or 4, they carried water, fed chickens, or gathered firewood. By 6 or 7, they were helping in fields, planting seeds, or scaring birds from crops. Older boys learned to swing axes, drive oxen, and fire muskets. Girls were taught to spin yarn, sew clothing, churn butter, and care for younger siblings. Childhood was not a protected stage of life, but a training ground for survival. Diaries from the 18th century note how a child of 10 years works as a man, reflecting both pride and necessity in the labor of the young. Education, when available, was fragile and inconsistent. In some communities, log schoolhouses offered rudimentary lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Teachers were often poorly paid, compensated in food or labor. School terms were short, interrupted by planting and harvest seasons when children's labor was needed at home. Many children learned to read from the Bible alone, their literacy shaped by religious devotion rather than formal schooling. For countless others, education was abandoned entirely in favor of work. Yet even limited schooling provided hope for a better future, and parents often sacrificed to send children when possible. Play did exist, but it was woven into the rhythms of work. Children fashioned toys from scraps of wood or corn cobs, played games with stones, or raced barefoot in fields. Stories and songs passed down by parents filled long winter nights, offering moments of imagination amid hardship. Yet play was always secondary to survival. Childhood was brief, and children grew into responsibility long before they reached adolescence. Danger surrounded them. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. Children drowned in rivers while fetching water, were crushed by falling trees, or burned in cabin fires sparked by open hearths. Epidemics claimed the youngest first, sweeping through families with terrifying speed. Parents buried children in shallow graves near cabins, sometimes losing several within a single season. For surviving siblings, grief was an inescapable part of growing up, instilling resilience but also deep scars. The wilderness also forced children into roles of defense. On isolated farms, boys as young as 12 carried muskets to guard livestock or hunt game. Accounts from the Ohio Valley describe teenagers standing watch at night while fathers were away. Girls, too, learned to load and fire weapons, defending cabins when necessary. These moments became part of frontier legend, remembered as proof of youthful bravery, but for the children themselves, they were simply necessities of survival. Religion shaped childhood profoundly. Families taught scripture as both moral guide and source of comfort. Prayers were recited morning and night, and hymns memorized alongside chores. Ministers emphasized discipline and obedience, reinforcing the idea that children's labor was a sacred duty. Yet religion also gave children hope, promising eternal reward in a world where death was constant. Many parents found comfort in believing that lost infants had become angels, easing the pain of frequent funerals. Cultural traditions shaped their upbringing as well. Immigrant families brought European customs, songs, and games, blending them with new experiences of the wilderness. Encounters with indigenous peoples also influenced childhood, sometimes through shared play or exchanges of knowledge. Native children taught settler children to track animals, gather wild plants, or build simple shelters. These lessons, though often informal, expanded the survival skills of frontier youth and bridged cultural divides. However briefly, for girls, expectations were particularly demanding. From an early age, they were trained in domestic labor that prepared them for the endless cycle of motherhood and household management. Many married in their teens, stepping from childhood into the responsibilities of adult life with little transition. Letters from the era describe 15-year-old brides already caring for households and younger siblings. Childhood for girls ended almost as soon as it began, replaced by the burdens of adult survival. For boys, the wilderness offered both opportunity and risk. They learned independence early, hunting, trapping, and exploring the edges of settlements. Yet these freedoms carried dangerous encounters with predators, accidents with weapons, or confrontations with hostile raiding parties. Families mourned young sons lost while testing the limits of their environment. Each story of bravery carried its shadow of loss. Despite the hardships, children provided joy and hope. Their laughter in fields, their songs in cabins, and their presence at communal gatherings softened the harshness of frontier life. Parents saw in them the promise of continuity, the assurance that their sacrifices would not be in vain. Every child who survived into adulthood symbolized not only personal endurance, but the survival of the community itself. Over time, the resilience forged in childhood shaped the character of entire generations. Children who endured hunger, storms, and loss grew into adults hardened by experience but also skilled in survival. They carried forward knowledge of farming, hunting, and healing, passing it to their own children. In this way, the legacy of the frontier was not only built by adults, but by the countless children who bore its hardships from the moment they could walk. The children of the wilderness remind us that the frontier was never simply a story of pioneers and explorers. It was also a story of boys and girls who shouldered burdens beyond their years, who faced dangers that many adults today could not imagine, and who lived lives where play and survival blurred together. Their resilience was as vital to survival as the axes of their fathers or the endurance of their mothers. Without them, the fragile dream of taming the frontier would have collapsed long before it began. On the frontier, death was never distant. It lingered at the edge of every cabin, followed families along every trail, and shadowed every field they cleared. Unlike in settled towns or cities, where mortality was softened by institutions, graveyards, and rituals. Death on the frontier was raw, immediate, and unavoidable. For families who had left behind the crowded villages of Europe in search of land and freedom, the price of that independence was to live and die on uncertain ground, where loss was a daily reality. Infant mortality haunted every household. Children died from fevers, accidents, or hunger before parents even learned their voices. In many families, nearly half of all infants failed to reach their 5th birthday. Parents dug small graves within sight of their cabins, often marking them with crude wooden crosses or stones. Graveyards were rare in scattered settlements, so the land itself became a resting place for the young. The grief was staggering, but life demanded that mothers and fathers return quickly to work. Death became routine, not from indifference, but because mourning could not halt the struggle for survival. Women bore perhaps the heaviest risks. Childbirth, already dangerous in Europe, became even more perilous in the wilderness. Without trained doctors or access to sterile instruments, complications such as hemorrhage or infection often proved fatal. Letters and diaries from the 18th and 19th centuries tell of men burying wives and newborns on the same day. Their loss compounded by the immediate need to care for surviving children. For frontier women, the cradle and the grave stood side by side, constant reminders of how fragile life remained. Men, too, lived under the constant threat of sudden death. Falling trees, hunting accidents, and injuries with axes or plows could kill within moments. With no medical aid, even a broken leg could lead to infection and death. Farmers, trappers, and hunters carried the knowledge that every day of labor might be their last. Communities remembered such deaths with solemnity, but they also recognized their frequency as part of frontier life. Disease amplified the sense of mortality. Epidemics swept through settlements without warning, striking down entire families in a matter of days. Smallpox, cholera, dysentery, and diphtheria could reduce thriving communities to near desolation. The graves left behind often outnumbered the survivors. Ministers preached that such losses were the will of God, while others interpreted them as punishment or trial. Whatever the explanation, the result was the same: fresh mounds of earth on the edges of cabins. Silent testimonies to nature's power. Death shaped not only families, but communities. Funerals, when possible, were deeply communal events. Neighbors gathered to dig graves, comfort the bereaved, and offer food. Hymns were sung, scripture read, and prayers offered in the open air. Yet often, distance or danger meant families buried their dead alone, conducting rituals with only a handful of witnesses. Some graves went unmarked, their locations lost as families moved or settlements vanished. The wilderness itself became a vast cemetery, layered with stories that disappeared with time. Religious belief provided comfort in the face of relentless loss. Families clung to the hope of heaven, imagining children as angels or loved ones reunited in eternal peace. Sermons emphasized endurance, portraying death not as an end but as a passage. Faith gave meaning where explanations were scarce, and it helped families accept what might otherwise have been unbearable. But alongside faith, fear and superstition persisted. Some settlers interpreted unusual deaths as omens, or blamed curses and witchcraft for epidemics. Death was not only physical but spiritual, a force that could not be fully understood or controlled. The presence of death shaped psychology from an early age. Children grew up with constant reminders of mortality. They saw siblings die, parents mourn, and graves dug within sight of their homes. This exposure produced resilience, but also a certain hardness, a recognition that life was fleeting and fragile. Later, memoirs reveal how deeply this shaped identity. Survivors often described themselves as living on borrowed time, grateful for each season endured. Despite its constancy, death did not extinguish hope. Families continued to expand, to build, to dream of better futures for their children. The shadow of mortality deepened their determination. Each harvest completed, each child who survived another winter, felt like a triumph over forces that sought to erase them. Death was a companion, but it was not always victorious. Survival itself became a form of defiance in the long memory of frontier history. The graves that dotted cabins, trails, and fields became silent markers of sacrifice. They remind us that the settlement of wilderness was not achieved only through strength, but also through loss. Every cleared field stood on ground where lives had ended. Every town that eventually grew had its foundation in the countless graves of those who did not live to see its prosperity. The frontier story cannot be told without death. It was constant, it was brutal, and it shaped every decision families made. Yet in enduring its presence, in burying their dead and pressing forward, families forged a culture of resilience that defined generations to come. Death was a constant companion, but so was the will to survive. The frontier was not only a place of hardship and loss, it was also a forge for stories. Out of endless toil, hunger, and danger, families created legends of survival that carried across generations. These tales were born in cabins lit by firelight, repeated at communal gatherings, and later recorded in letters, journals, and local histories. They transformed daily struggles into narratives of endurance, shaping how frontier life was remembered long after the wilderness had been. Subdued legends often centered on individual acts of bravery. Men who faced down wolves, women who defended cabins alone, or children who endured storms became symbols of resilience. One account from the Ohio Valley told of a widow who, after her husband's death, raised her children while fending off repeated attacks by wild animals and raiders. Such stories, though rooted in truth, grew larger with each retelling, becoming part of local folklore. They served not only as entertainment, but as moral lessons, reinforcing the values of courage, perseverance, and faith. Women featured prominently in many legends, though their contributions were often cast in extraordinary circumstances rather than daily endurance. Tales of mothers traveling miles through snow to fetch help for sick children, or of wives keeping farms alive after husbands died, became part of the cultural memory. These narratives highlighted women's resilience, even as society continued to frame them as secondary figures. The reality was that countless women performed such feats not once, but throughout their lives, quietly, consistently, without recognition. Children, too, entered the lore of survival. Stories circulated of boys as young as 12, standing guard with muskets, or of girls saving siblings from fires or floods. While these accounts often bore the hallmarks of exaggeration, they reflected genuine roles children played. In a world where every member of the household was essential, heroism was not confined to adults. The legends of brave children served as reminders that survival was a collective effort, carried by all ages. Disasters generated their own folklore. Great fires, devastating floods, and deadly storms became markers of community identity. Survivors told and retold how neighbors rebuilt barns after fires, or how entire settlements endured famines by sharing food. These stories framed tragedy not as defeat, but as resilience, emphasizing unity in the face of catastrophe. In time, they evolved into communal myths, binding people together through shared memory. The line between fact and legend blurred easily. Frontier life was so extreme, so filled with trials, that even true stories seemed improbable. A man walking miles with a broken leg, a woman giving birth alone in a cabin, or a family surviving weeks on bark and berries could sound mythical to later generations. These accounts, recorded in family histories, served as reminders that survival often required feats bordering on the impossible. Religious faith infused many legends with spiritual meaning. Survivors described miraculous escapes as acts of divine intervention. Families who endured famines credited answered prayers. Those who survived storms spoke of angels guiding them. Ministers wove these stories into sermons, framing the frontier not just as a physical battleground but as a spiritual one. Legends of survival thus reinforced both resilience and faith, teaching that endurance came through human effort and divine providence together. Superstition also shaped folklore. Tales of ghostly warnings, prophetic dreams, or omens before disasters circulated widely. Families believed that strange animal behavior or unusual weather often foretold danger. These stories, though rooted in superstition, became part of the larger narrative of survival, reflecting the deep psychological need to make sense of unpredictable dangers. Legends of survival often outlived the individuals who inspired them. Families passed stories through generations, preserving them as part of their identity. Towns celebrated founders who endured famine or defended settlements, erecting monuments or naming places in their honor. These stories became part of regional pride, shaping how communities understood their origins. The mythology of the frontier also fed into broader cultural narratives. By the 19th century, writers and politicians celebrated pioneers as symbols of national character. The rugged farmer with axe and plow, the mother with endless endurance, the child who grew into a hardened adult all became part of the myth of the frontier as the crucible of democracy and independence. In reality, these stories simplified a far more complex history of loss, hardship, and fragility. But the legends endured, because they gave meaning to suffering and celebrated the spirit of survival at the same time. Legends obscured the darker realities. Tales of heroism often overshadowed stories of failure, despair, or abandonment. Families who fled, settlements that collapsed, or individuals broken by the wilderness were rarely remembered in the same way. Survival stories became selective memory, celebrating endurance while forgetting the cost. This shaping of memory was itself a survival strategy, turning trauma into pride and ensuring that descendants saw the frontier not only as a place of death, but as a legacy of resilience. In the end, the legends of survival reveal as much about psychology as history. They show how families needed to believe that their sacrifices were meaningful, that the suffering of parents and children was not in vain. Legends gave order to chaos, making sense of lives defined by uncertainty. They carried forward lessons of courage, endurance, and faith, ensuring that the frontier story was not only one of struggle, but also of triumph. The frontier was real, brutal, and unforgiving, but the stories it produced of women defending cabins, of children braving storms, of families enduring disasters lifted it into legend. These stories endure because they capture something universal, the human drive to endure against impossible odds. They remind us that while death was constant, survival was extraordinary and worth remembering. The frontier has long since vanished, its cabins replaced by towns, its clearings by fields, and its trails by highways. Yet its echoes remain not only into the landscape, but into the memory and culture of the people who once fought there. Silent war with nature. For the families who endured isolation, hunger, storms, and death, survival itself was victory. Their sacrifices built the foundations of communities that still stand today, though their names and graves are often forgotten. The frontier, in all its hardship, continues to speak through the echoes it left behind. These echoes survive in the stories passed down through generations. Tales of grandparents braving winters, of mothers birthing children alone in cabins, of fathers lost to accidents or disease. These memories became family legends. Around firesides and in letters, descendants carried these stories as proof of identity. Even as communities grew and prospered, the struggles of the past were never far from mind. The echo of hardship became a source of pride, a reminder that survival was won at great cost. They also remain in the values shaped by frontier life. The demand for resilience, self-reliance, and cooperation forged traits that became embedded in cultural memory. Settlers learned that no family could endure alone, that neighbors were as essential as tools, and that survival demanded both independence and solidarity. These lessons shaped the democratic and communal spirit of later generations, creating traditions of shared labor and mutual aid that lasted long after the wilderness was subdued. The echoes can be traced in religion and belief as well. The prayers whispered in cabins, the hymns sung at gravesides, and the rituals of hope and superstition formed a spiritual legacy. They remind us that families clung to faith not as luxury, but as necessity. Religion offered meaning to loss, while superstition offered order to chaos. Together, they left a cultural inheritance of endurance through belief, reflected even today in rituals of remembrance and resilience. Even the landscape carries echoes. Fields that were once forests, roads that were once trails, and towns that grew from clusters of cabins stand as silent witnesses. Scattered across valleys and plains are cemeteries where weathered stones mark the lives of those who endured and those who did not. In many places, unmarked graves lie beneath farms and towns, the remains of families whose stories were lost but whose struggles made later life possible. Literature and folklore amplified these echoes into myth. Writers of the 19th century transformed the frontier into a national story, celebrating the rugged farmer, the enduring mother, and the brave child. These myths simplified reality, but they also preserved memory. They turned the pain of hunger, disease, and loss into a narrative of triumph. Through novels, sermons, and later films, the frontier became less a place and more an idea, an enduring symbol of human resilience against impossible odds. The echoes also shaped national identity. Politicians celebrated the frontier as the crucible of democracy, where freedom and independence were forged. Communities remembered their founders not as victims of hardship, but as victors over it. This legacy, though often romanticized, carried the truth that survival was extraordinary. Every farm that prospered, every town that grew, stood upon the endurance of families who faced death daily and still persevered. Yet the echoes are not only of triumph, they are also of loss. Countless families disappeared, their cabins abandoned, their stories unrecorded. Epidemics wiped out settlements, storms destroyed farms, and famine forced families to flee. Their names are absent from records, but their absence itself is part of the story. The silence left behind is an echo too, reminding us that not all survived, and that progress was bought with forgotten lives. Today, these echoes challenge us to remember the frontier honestly, not as a romantic dream of boundless opportunity, but as a place where families endured unimaginable hardship. The stories of hunger, disease, isolation, and death reveal a reality as brutal as it was formative. To honor the frontier is not to ignore its suffering, but to recognize the courage it demanded. The true legacy lies not in myths, but in the endurance of ordinary people who carried extraordinary burdens. In the end, the silent war with nature was never won. The wilderness was tamed, but the forces of storms, disease, and hunger never disappeared. Families survived not by conquering nature, but by adapting, enduring, and finding strength together. The echo of the frontier is this truth: that survival was never guaranteed, and every life carried forward was a fragile victory. The cabins have rotted, the trails have faded, and the forests have regrown. Yet the echoes remain, and the values of resilience. In the cemeteries of the forgotten, in the stories passed down by descendants. The frontier is gone, but its voice lingers, reminding us of the price of survival and of the courage of families who dared to live on the edge of the wilderness.